At 16,000 feet, physics just doesn't care about your pronouns.
Right. It really doesn't.
Yeah, on January 5th, 2024, when that door basically blew off an Alaska Airlines flight midair, author Conrad Riker, well, he didn't just see a catastrophic engineering failure. He saw the mathematical collapse of Western civilization.
Whoa, absolutely. The literal collapse.
Welcome to the Jew Dives. I am so thrilled you are here with us today.
Yeah.
Before we jump in, if you haven't already, please just take a quick second to hit the like and subscribe buttons. I mean, it genuinely helps the show, and it guarantees you won't miss out on these exhaustive explorations into, the most fascinating and complex ideas shaping our reality.
Yeah, it's a crucial mechanism for keeping the show running. And while today's exploration is going to demand every single ounce of our analytical attention, we are looking at a highly systematized, incredibly aggressive piece of modern philosophy.
That might honestly be the understatement of the year. So our mission today is this exhaustive, rigorous review of a highly provocative 2026 ebook. It's titled Ersatz Elite: How Cultural Marxists Faked Civilization, and it's by Conrad Riker.
It's a heavy one.
It is. And right at the top, I just want to let you know that if you find yourself intrigued by the architecture of the arguments we are about to unpack, this ebook is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Right.
We're going to dive incredibly deep, obviously, but there is an entire universe of detail in the source material that you can, explore on your own.
The source material is incredibly dense. I mean, Riker synthesizes evolutionary biology, classical philosophy, linguistics, history. It basically reads like a formal mathematical proof diagnosing a terminal civilizational disease.
Right. Now, before we take a single step further, I need to make the guardrails of today's conversation explicitly clear to you, the listener, because this book is fiercely, unapologetically written as an intellectual arsenal for men's rights activists and the red-pilled manosphere.
Yeah, he does not hold back.
Exactly. The views presented by the author are highly politically charged, they were polarizing, and they pull absolutely no punches regarding gender, institutions, and modern culture. And because of that, I am declaring our absolute impartiality right here, right now. We are not taking sides today.
No.
We are not endorsing Conrad Riker's viewpoints, nor are we here to condemn them. Our sole mission is to impartially report on the ideas contained in the text. We are just going to act as your expert guides, to help you understand his intense perspective on the history of our institutions.
And his core thesis that these institutions have been entirely captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
Right. Our job is to break down what he is arguing and, more importantly, the structural mechanics of how he actually constructs those arguments.
And looking at the mechanics of his argument is where this gets so fascinating. Because Riker places this massive emphasis on language and definitions. He basically believes that to understand the collapse of an institution, you first have to look at the dictionary.
I want to start exactly there, actually, with the title itself. Ersatz Elite. I mean, we hear the word elite thrown around constantly in political discourse, usually to describe, wealthy people or politicians.
Yeah.
But Riker is using these two words very specifically, right? To set the stage for a concept he calls the gynocentric matrix.
Yes.
Walk us through the etymology here. What exactly is an Ersatz Elite in the context of this book?
Well, to really grasp his thesis, we have to look at the German roots of the word Ersatz. It derives from the verb ersetzen, which literally translates to replace or to substitute.
Okay.
And it entered broader English usage around wartime, specifically World Wars I and II. Like, if a population was under an embargo and couldn't get real coffee, they would be issued an ersatz coffee, which was often made from roasted acorns or chicory.
Oh, wow. So it's not just an alternative,
Yeah.
The connotation is that it is fundamentally inferior. Like a cheap imitation designed to just deceive the consumer into thinking they have the real thing.
Precisely. It is a cardboard cutout of reality. Now, Riker contrasts this artificiality with the historical concept of the aristocracy. When we hear aristocrat today, we usually think of trust funds and inherited wealth.
Right, like old money.
Yeah, but Riker reaches back to the Greek roots. Aristos means the best, the most excellent, or the most virtuous. And kratos means rule or power. So in Riker's historical framework, a true aristocrat, the historical elite, was a man who had mastered the virtues through brutal physical and intellectual apprenticeship.
So it was earned.
Exactly. He earned his place at the top of the hierarchy because he was the one who could actually build the aqueduct, defend the city walls, enforce order. His authority was a direct reflection of his objective competence and his willingness to sacrifice.
And Riker's core argument is that the people currently operating the levers of power in the West possess absolutely none of those traits, like zero.
He argues they are the exact opposite. Riker claims that today's ruling class, so the credential HR managers, the diversity consultants, the university administrators, the media commentators, they are an Ersatz Elite.
Because they haven't built anything.
Right. They haven't built physical infrastructure, they haven't conquered anything through merit or martial bravery. Instead, he argues, they have occupied pre-existing institutions through bureaucratic capture and semantic manipulation. They are essentially managing the managed decline of a civilization they are fundamentally incapable of building themselves.
I'm trying to picture how he frames this dynamically. He's essentially saying they are parasites living inside a host organism that someone else built.
Yes, a perfect way to describe his view.
And this brings us to the environment this Ersatz Elite supposedly operates within, which Riker labels the gynocentric matrix. Let's define this for the listener, because he claims society is explicitly rigged against men, but simultaneously entirely dependent on them. How does he justify that paradox?
Well, he justifies it by looking at the flow of resources versus the flow of cultural respect. The gynocentric matrix, in his terminology, is a societal operating system that privileges female experience, subjective emotion, and therapeutic language at the absolute expense of male reality, objective truth, and masculine authority.
He paints a very stark, almost dystopian picture of this dynamic. He basically argues that society extracts all the hard utility from men, the tax revenue, the grueling physical labor, the maintenance of the deep-sea oil rigs, the high-voltage electrical grids, the sewer systems, but violently demonizes the masculine authority that historically accompanied that burden.
The financial aspect is a really major pillar of his argument here. He cites economic data suggesting that men, in the aggregate, remain the only net lifetime taxpayers.
Oh, really? The only net taxpayers?
According to his analysis, yes. This means that the surplus economic production of men is what actually funds the vast bureaucratic leviathan, the welfare state, the administrative state, the subsidized academic institutions. Yet, Riker points out, this very leviathan actively seeks to disenfranchise the men funding it, framing their natural masculine instincts as toxic.
So it's like a protection racket.
He views it as a massive civilization-scale protection racket. Society demands that men take the bullet, build the roads, and fund the treasury, but completely refuses to let men hold the steering wheel.
It sounds like, think about a hostile corporate takeover. Okay. The new board of directors actively despises the legacy engineers who actually built the software architecture. They mock the engineers' culture, they hate how blunt they are, yet they still demand those exact same engineers work 80-hour weeks to keep the servers running. And while the engineers are keeping the company alive, the board forces them to attend mandatory seminars on how toxic their engineering mindset is.
That analogy captures the exact structural dynamic Riker is critiquing perfectly. And to illustrate how this hostile takeover operates on a daily basis, he points his lens at two very specific modern institutions: corporate human resources departments and the family court system.
Let's look at the corporate world first, because that affects almost everyone.
Right. Well, Riker does not view human resources as an administrative department handling payroll and benefits. He defines modern HR as a private corporate Stasi.
The Stasi, the secret police of East Germany. That is an incredibly aggressive comparison. He's saying the person organizing the company health plan is running a totalitarian surveillance state.
The comparison relies on their respective methodologies of control. Riker argues that HR doesn't use physical violence, obviously. It uses passive-aggressive therapeutic language to pathologize masculine directness.
Pathologize it, meaning treating it like a sickness.
Yes. In Riker's framework, natural masculine instincts sow ambition, hierarchy, intense competition, and rigorous, unvarnished truth-telling. They are treated by HR as workplace diseases that need to be quarantined. He claims HR enforces a female-coded hierarchy that prioritizes emotional safety and inclusion over objective truth and actual competence.
Let's play this out so the listener can see the mechanics of this in action. Say there's a male software engineer. He's in a meeting, and he bluntly points out that a new project timeline proposed by a manager is mathematically impossible. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He just lays out the math and says the plan is going to fail. In Riker's view, how does the HR Stasi handle that?
Well, in Riker's view, HR isn't going to look at the engineer's math at all. They are going to look at how his bluntness made the manager feel. If the manager claims they felt unsafe or attacked by the engineer's tone, the objective reality of the math becomes entirely irrelevant.
The math doesn't matter.
Right. The engineer will be penalized, maybe he's sent to sensitivity training or put on a performance improvement plan, Not because he was wrong, but because his masculine adherence to objective reality disrupted the Matrix's demand for emotional comfort. The Ersatz Elite prioritizes the subjective feeling over the objective fact.
And if you extrapolate that across an entire economy, you get a system that actively punishes the people who actually know how things work.
But as scorching as his critique of HR is, he saves his absolute heaviest artillery for the family court industrial complex. He doesn't just call the legal system biased. He refers to family courts as a temple of Moloch.
Moloch, for historical context, was the ancient Canaanite deity associated with child sacrifice.
Just horrific imagery.
Yes. He uses this terrifying imagery intentionally because he argues that the family court system is not a legal framework for resolving domestic disputes fairly. He defines it as a state-sanctioned wealth transfer mechanism designed to ritualistically dismantle fatherhood. He argues that the court demands the sacrifice of a man's children, the liquidation of his accumulated wealth, and the destruction of his psychological well-being, and it's all placed on the altar of this gynocentric matrix.
And the mechanics of this, according to the text, are brutally efficient. Riker views the family court as the ultimate weapon of the Matrix because it reduces a competent man to nothing more than an ATM.
Just a paycheck.
Just a paycheck. It strips him of his natural historical right to guide and raise his own offspring, handing the arbitrary power over his resources and his visitation schedule to a state-backed judge. Riker argues that the state has effectively replaced the husband. The woman is incentivized to break the family because the state will step in using the threat of armed police and prison to force the man to subsidize her independence. It is the ultimate extraction of male utility without male authority.
Okay, if we step back and accept Riker's premise for a moment, that this massive hostile takeover has occurred, that the Ersatz Elite are in charge, and that institutions from HR to the courts are designed to extract male labor while punishing masculinity. The most obvious question is, how did this happen?
Right.
I mean, there was no violent revolution. We didn't see tanks rolling down the streets of Western capitals. How did this specific ideological group manage to seize control of the corporate boardrooms, the universities, and the legal system without firing a single shot?
This is where Riker pivots from sociology into deep historical analysis. To understand how the takeover happened, you have to understand that the architects of this shift realized very early on that they could not win a traditional physical war.
They couldn't win a shooting war.
Exactly. Riker traces the blueprint back to the early 20th century, specifically analyzing the evolution of Marxist theory. We really have to look at a figure named Georg Lukács.
Lukács was a Hungarian Marxist, right? Operating right after World War I.
Yes. So, in 1919, Georg Lukács served as the Deputy Commissar of Culture in the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic. Lukács was trying to figure out why the Marxist revolution hadn't spontaneously swept across Europe as everyone predicted it would.
Because Marx thought it was inevitable.
Right. But Lukács realized that Western civilization was anchored by these deeply rooted cultural institutions, specifically Christian sexual ethics and the traditional patriarchal family. He hypothesized that you could not overthrow the economic system until you destroyed the cultural immune system.
The cultural immune system.
Yeah. So during his brief time in power, he initiated educational programs designed to explicitly sexualize children and undermine parental authority. His logic was that if you sever the roots of the culture, the civilization will eventually collapse from within.
But the Hungarian Soviet Republic only lasted a few months. I mean, it was failure, right?
The government failed, yes, but the ideas survived and they were refined. And this brings us to the Frankfurt School. They were a group of Marxist intellectuals in Weimar Germany, including thinkers like Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno. When the Nazis rose to power, these intellectuals fled to America and eventually set up shop at Columbia University. And when they got to America, they experienced a profound ideological crisis.
Because they looked around and realized the traditional Marxist economic revolution was fundamentally impossible in the United States.
Exactly. They saw that the American working class was actually thriving under capitalism. I mean, the workers had cars, they were buying houses in the suburbs, they had upward mobility. You simply cannot convince a man with a mortgage, a steady job, and a full refrigerator to violently overthrow the system that's feeding his family.
So if you can't incite a class war based on economics, what do? Riker says they pivoted to psychological and cultural warfare.
They executed one of the most significant ideological shifts in modern history. Marcuse and Adorno essentially fused Karl Marx with Sigmund Freud. They deliberately shifted their strategy from economic oppression to psychological oppression.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Riker argues that they began to weaponize psychology to pathologize traditional structures. They wrote dense academic literature defining the traditional patriarchal family structure and the masculine repression of impulsive desires, not as the necessary bedrock of a stable, high-functioning civilization, but as a literal psychological disorder.
Wow.
They tried to convince the West that the very masculinity and stoicism that built the modern world was actually a fascist sickness that needed to be cured.
Wait, back up. Are you telling me they actually believed they could dismantle the most powerful civilization on Earth just by writing academic papers and changing the definitions of psychological terms? I mean, that sounds insane. How does that practically work on a societal level? How do you go from a few professors at Columbia to capturing the entire legal and corporate system?
You do it through a concept popularized by Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist whose work Riker heavily relies upon in the book. Gramsci coined the strategy of the long march through the institution.
The Long March.
Yeah. Gramsci understood that in the industrialized West, power doesn't reside in the factories. It resides in the cultural means of production. You don't need a militia. You need to capture the schools, the media, the universities, the seminaries, and the bureaucracy.
You call them organic intellectuals, right?
Yes. You embed these organic intellectuals into the institutions. The sole purpose is to slowly, methodically facilitate the progressive agenda from the inside out.
They become the gatekeepers?
Exactly. They become the HR managers, the curriculum writers, the textbook publishers. They transform the host organism so slowly and incrementally that the host doesn't even realize it's dying until the vital organs shut down.
But the mechanism they used to do this is what Riker calls Gramscian grammatical warfare. He says before they targeted the state, they targeted the dictionary. It's one thing to say they embedded intellectuals in universities. But Riker takes us a step further. He argues this isn't just about campus politics or hurt feelings. He believes that by changing the definitions of words, you can actually rewrite physical reality. How does changing a dictionary definition actually dismantle a civilization?
It dismantles civilization because language is the operating system of human logic. Language dictates how we perceive, categorize, and interact with reality. If you control the grammar, you control the boundaries of thought itself.
Okay, give us an example.
Well, Riker gives several profound historical examples of this semantic theft. Let's look at how the word virtue has been inverted. Today, if someone says you are virtuous, it usually implies you are passively nice, compliant, harmless, or exhibiting what Riker calls a sickly sweet empathy.
Just being a nice, non-threatening person.
Right. But that wasn't the original meaning at all. The root of the word is the Latin virtus, which explicitly comes from vir, meaning man.
Oh my God.
In classical antiquity, virtue meant martial courage, physical bravery, and the masculine strength required to enforce order and protect the weak. By slowly shifting the definition of virtue to mean passive compliance and emotional vulnerability, you linguistically pacify the exact demographic of men who are biologically designed to defend the civilization. You convince them that being harmless is the highest moral good.
He also outlines how they mathematically twisted foundational legal concepts, too, like equality and justice.
This is a really devastating part of his linguistic analysis. Riker points out that equality was historically understood as a mathematical concept, or a concept of equal standing before the law, equality of opportunity. You are judged by the exact same rules.
Right.
But the cultural Marxists, through their long march, transformed it into equity, which demands equality of outcome. They changed the definition so that any disparity in outcome is automatically framed as systemic oppression.
So the starting line doesn't matter, only the finish line.
Exactly. And justice, which for centuries was symbolized by a blindfolded woman weighing objective facts on a scale, was weaponized entirely. Riker argues modern social justice is nothing more than a tool of raw, unprincipled envy. If one demographic group has built more wealth or achieved higher mastery than another, the new grammar dictates that it must be the result of theft. It completely ignores variables like merit, cultural habits, or effort.
But the most explosive example he gives, the one that really anchors his whole theory on the gynocentric matrix, is the hijacking of the word gender.
Oh, this is the masterstroke of grammatical warfare, according to Riker. He points out that up until the mid-20th century, the word gender was strictly a grammatical classification. It was used by linguists to describe the masculine, feminine, or neuter designations of nouns in languages like French or German.
Like a table might be feminine in French.
Yes, exactly. It had absolutely nothing to do with human biology or identity.
Because biological reality was exclusively covered by the word sex. And he goes into the etymology of that, too, to show how grounded it was in physical reality.
He does, and it's fascinating. He notes that the word sex derives from the Latin secere, which translates literally to cut, to divide, or to bisect. It represents the objective, immutable biological bifurcation of the human species into two distinct complementary reproductive poles.
There is no spectrum in a cut.
Right, there is no spectrum in the word secere, it is a binary cut. But Riker argues that the cultural Marxist engineers faced a problem. You cannot socially engineer biological reality. They needed a linguistic blank slate, a word detached from biology where they could rewrite human nature, so they deliberately hijacked the grammatical term gender, stripped it of its linguistic context, and overlaid it onto human identity.
I'm following the history here, but I want to push back on the motive. Why go through all that linguistic gymnastics? What is the actual strategic benefit of convincing a society to adopt a new word for their identity?
Because, Riker claims, this was a calculated maneuver straight out of the Fabian socialist strategy playbook. The Fabians and the Marxists realized that the traditional patriarchal family is the primary fortress standing between the individual and absolute state power.
Right.
A strong family is loyal to its kinship network, its faith, and its father. To conquer the population, the state has to break the family. To break the family, you have to sever human beings from their grounding in biological reality.
I see. Because if a person's identity is rooted in biology, it's immutable. The state literally can't touch it.
Exactly. But if you can convince a population that their biological sex is merely a socially constructed gender assigned at birth, they become atomized, fluid, and perfectly malleable subjects. They are no longer anchored by nature. They become completely dependent on the state, the bureaucratic leviathan, the medical establishment, the academic theorists to validate and affirm their very existence. The state replaces biology as the arbiter of reality.
So by changing the language, they untethered society from biological reality, making everyone dependent on the bureaucracy to tell them who they are. It's a massive, sweeping claim. But Riker doesn't just leave this in the realm of psychology, sociology, or gender theory. He pushes this directly into the physical world.
He does.
If language alters our perception of reality, how does this affect the physical infrastructure of our society? Because Riker argues that this linguistic shift, this abandonment of objective truth, leads directly to a literal physical crisis of competence.
This is where Riker's background in formal logic really shines. He applies classical logic to diagnose what he sees as a systemic, inevitable collapse of the physical world. He doesn't just say things are getting worse, he uses a devastating formal syllogism in the text to prove that they must get worse.
Let's walk through the logic of this syllogism step by step. Break it down for us.
So, a classical syllogism has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Riker sets up his major premise like, this civilization is the accumulated, objective product of applied human competence. Maintaining functional institutions, whether it's the electrical grid, the aerospace industry, or the surgical theater, requires absolute, objective standards of mastery.
That seems undeniable. You need people who objectively know what they are doing to build and maintain complex systems. A bridge either holds the weight or it doesn't.
Correct. Then he introduces the minor premise institutional woke diversity mandates explicitly and intentionally penalize objective competence in favor of arbitrary demographic compliance. By definition, if you are selecting a candidate based on their demographic traits to fulfill an equity quota, you are subverting the absolute standard of merit.
You're compromising.
You are replacing the objective standard of craftsmanship with a subjective, politically motivated metric of inclusion.
And so, the logical conclusion.
Conclusion. Therefore, these cultural Marxist policies are structurally, mathematically guaranteed to destroy civilization. Yes. By systematically rejecting objective standards of competence at every level of the corporate and institutional hierarchy, the system inevitably, unavoidably collapses under the weight of its own enforced incompetence.
He's not just speaking metaphorically here about society collapsing either. He anchors this abstract syllogism to a very specific, terrifying real-world event, the incident with Alaska Airlines Flight 1282.
Yes. On January 5th, 2024, a plug door blew completely out of the fuselage of a Boeing 737 and MAX 9 aircraft at 16,000 feet. The cabin depressurized instantly. It was an absolute miracle no one was sucked out and killed.
It's horrifying.
Riker uses this terrifying event as the literal physical manifestation of a metaphysical rot. He looks at the corporate diversity reports of these massive aerospace manufacturers where executive bonuses are tied to demographic hiring quotas, and he writes that at 16,000 feet, physics does not care about your pronouns, and gravity is entirely indifferent to your corporate diversity metrics.
It sounds like, if we follow this logic to its absolute extreme, the author isn't just saying these diversity policies are unfair to the highly competent men who might be passed over for jobs. He's claiming these policies are a literal violation of the laws of physics.
Yes.
It's like a construction company deciding to build a suspension bridge, using empathy and good intentions instead of high-tensile steel. You can be as inclusive as possible, you can have the most diverse board of directors in human history, but if the tensile strength of the materials is miscalculated because you lowered the engineering standards to meet a quota, the bridge falls down. People die.
The bridge falling down is precisely the mechanism he is warning about. And he gives this phenomenon a name, comparing modern woke engineering to one of the most disastrous historical catastrophes of the 20th century, Soviet Lysenkoism.
This is a deep historical cut, but it's really vital to his argument. Explain Trofim Lysenko to the listener, because the parallels Riker draws here are chilling.
So, Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet agronomist who rose to immense power under Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. Lysenko completely rejected classical Mendelian genetics.
Why?
Because classical genetics relies on immutable, inherited traits. Lysenko viewed that as a bourgeois, fascist science that contradicted Marxist ideology. Marxist ideology claimed that human beings were entirely blank slates, perfectly malleable, and could be molded into the new Soviet man through environmental conditioning.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Lysenko applied this Marxist theory to agriculture. He believed that crops, like winter wheat, could be trained to adapt to freezing environments through environmental conditioning rather than through selective genetic breeding.
Wait, he thought he could politically re-educate a plant.
Essentially, yes.
Right.
He believed that if you subjected seeds to freezing temperatures, they would simply adapt out of biological solidarity, aligning perfectly with Marxist ideology. And because Lysenko had Stalin's backing, his pseudoscience became the official state policy.
I'm trying to imagine the real-world consequences of faking agricultural data on a national scale.
Yeah.
What actually happened?
Absolute disaster. Because Lysenko's theories were driven by political ideology rather than empirical reality, Soviet agriculture collapsed, the crops died, millions of people starved to death in horrific famines across the Soviet Union and later in Maoist China, which also adopted Lysenko's methods.
Millions dead.
Millions. But what makes the parallel to today so important for Riker is how the state handled the failure. The Soviet state didn't admit they were wrong. Instead, they purged the actual competent geneticists. Thousands of real scientists were fired, imprisoned, or sent to the gulags, and they were replaced with ideologically compliant sycophants who were willing to parrot Lysenko's lies.
And Riker's arguing that the exact same dynamic, the purging of competence to protect a political lie, is happening today in Western aerospace, medicine, and engineering.
Exactly. He argues that Ersatz Elite are purging the competent builders who, historically and statistically, he notes, are overwhelmingly men, and replacing them with diversity hires who align with the new state ideology of equity. Lysenkoism destroyed Soviet agriculture because Marxist biology cannot grow wheat. Riker argues that woke engineering is destroying Western infrastructure because inclusion cannot override aerodynamics.
He calls it the formal tyranny of the mediocre. He says these people are fundamentally incapable of building the towering, complex architecture of Western civilization. So, like spoiled, chaotic children, they demand unearned entry into the halls of mastery, and when the complex machinery baffles them, they tear the buildings down from the inside to hide their own incompetence.
And he emphasizes a bitter irony here, too. An entire parasitic apparatus, the HR departments, the diversity consultants, the academic theorists, only functions because the competent men are still, for now, keeping the electrical grids running. The bloated leviathan that funds these initiatives is literally subsidized by the sweat, labor, and taxation of the very men it seeks to replace and demonize.
So we've looked at the corporate boardrooms, the legal system, and the physical infrastructure. We've seen how Riker applies his theory of cultural Marxism to institutions. But how does this framework apply to the biological, interpersonal relationships between men and women? Because Chapter 5 transitions from corporate critique into a very dark biological diagnosis of what he calls toxic femininity.
This is where Riker strips away all societal romanticism and dives heavily into evolutionary psychology. He wants to unmask what he views as the destructive, primitive reality of modern sexual dynamics.
Okay, break that down.
To do this, he relies on stark biological imperatives. He specifically cites the research of evolutionary psychologists like Stephen Gangestad, Randy Thornhill, and Christine Garver-Apgar. He uses their work to explain two interconnected concepts, which are the dual mating strategy and ovulatory shift theory.
Okay, this is pretty dense academic territory. Let's break this down clearly for you, the listener. What exactly is the dual mating strategy in an evolutionary context?
Well, evolutionary psychology suggests that, looking back at the Pleistocene era, human females faced a complex biological dilemma regarding reproduction and survival. To produce healthy, robust offspring capable of surviving a brutal environment, women needed the genetic traits of strong, aggressive, physically dominant men.
The alpha traits.
Right. These are the traits associated with high testosterone, facial symmetry, physical formidability, the so-called alphas. However, these highly aggressive alpha men were often volatile. They were busy conquering, fighting, or seeking multiple mates. They were not necessarily the best long-term providers or the most reliable fathers to stick around the cave.
Right, because if a woman had a child with an alpha who immediately left for the next valley, she and the child might literally starve during the winter.
Exactly. So women also desperately needed the stable, reliable, nurturing traits of the beta males, the less aggressive men who would stick around, provide resources, chop the wood, protect the tribe, and help raise the children. The dual mating strategy posits that unrestrained biological hypergamy, the innate female drive to mate with the highest status male possible, seeks to extract a dual benefit.
They want both.
Right. The strategy is to extract long-term provisioning, labor, and security from the reliable betas, while simultaneously securing optimal genetic lineage from the sexually exciting alphas.
And Riker connects this dual strategy directly to the ovulatory shift theory. How does the biological cycle play into this behavior?
The theory demonstrates that a woman's mate preferences actually shift subconsciously across her menstrual cycle. During the narrow window of peak fertility, when conception is most likely, studies suggest women are statistically more drawn to those alpha markers of genetic quality, deeper voices, dominant behavior, physical symmetry. However, during the luteal phase, when conception is unlikely, their preference shifts toward the nurturing, reliable beta traits that signal long-term provisioning and compliance.
Okay, I understand the evolutionary biology here. I mean, it makes sense for survival on the savannah tens of thousands of years ago. But how does Riker connect this ancient biological theory back to his modern critique of cultural Marxism and the gynocentric matrix?
Riker argues that throughout civilized history, patriarchal structures, orthodox religion, and intense social stigma were constructed specifically to constrain this destructive biological hypergamy.
To keep it in check.
Yes. Civilization requires men to build and maintain it. A man will not invest his blood, sweat, and resources into building a family or a society unless he is guaranteed paternity and loyalty. Patriarchy, in Riker's view, was the necessary cultural software designed to suppress the chaotic hardware of female hypergamy, ensuring stable families and a functioning society.
Let me guess. He argues that cultural Marxism is a virus that deletes that cultural software.
That is exactly his argument. He claims that cultural Marxism systematically removes all social, religious, and legal constraints on hypergamy. It removes the cultural stigma of divorce, it celebrates infidelity as finding oneself, and crucially, it subsidizes single motherhood through the welfare state.
By doing that, the state effectively becomes the ultimate beta provider.
Yes. Riker claims that the modern matrix intentionally commodifies men as disposable utilities. Society mocks the monogamous, loyal, hardworking provider husband as a boring cuckold. Meanwhile, pop culture and media encourage women to explore their sexuality and pursue the alpha thrill during their prime fertility years, often resulting in chaotic relationships with men who offer no stability.
Right.
Then, when women are older and realize they need resources, the state steps in through family courts, no-fault divorce, and heavy taxation to force the reliable, productive men to subsidize the fallout of those chaotic choices.
He lays a massive amount of the blame for this dynamic squarely on second-wave feminism. He calls it the most catastrophic lie in modern history.
He does. He argues that second-wave feminism executed a brilliant, devastating bait-and-switch. It sold women the illusion that traditional motherhood, raising children, and building a multi-generational family was a form of oppression. Simultaneously, it convinced them that becoming an atomized, taxed corporate cubicle worker for a megacorporation was the ultimate form of liberation.
And Riker views this not as women's liberation, but as a masterstroke of Marxist economic manipulation.
Absolutely. Think about the economic mechanics. By convincing women to abandon the home and enter the workforce en masse, Riker argues, the architects of this shift effectively doubled the labor pool overnight. When you double the supply of labor, you naturally suppress real wages.
Basic supply and demand.
Right. It made it mathematically harder for a single male income to support a family, forcing both parents to work just to survive. Furthermore, by forcing women into the cubicle, it forced them to hand their children over to state-run daycare centers and public schools at incredibly young ages.
Which Riker describes not as educational institutions, but as indoctrination centers.
Yes. The children are separated from the protective, authoritative influence of a patriarchal father, and instead molded by the state into compliant consumers and ideological soldiers. He says that feminism convinced women they were empowered, all while they were being systematically exploited by the very capitalist and bureaucratic systems they thought they were conquering. He has a haunting quote in this section, actually. "The prison has no walls when the prisoner believes she is free."
Let's pause here because this raises a massive question for the listener and something I find myself grappling with as we unpack this. The author paints an incredibly dark, almost predatory picture of modern relationships. He reduces the concepts of love, romance, and marriage to raw, cynical, biological resource extraction.
That's extremely cynical.
Right, so I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Is he actually justifying applying broad evolutionary shift theories, which are statistical averages across massive populations, to every single individual interaction a man has today? Is he saying every woman a man meets at a coffee shop is consciously executing a deceptive dual mating strategy?
It's a crucial distinction to make to understand his framework. Riker isn't arguing that every individual woman sits down with a spreadsheet and consciously plots out a dual mating strategy to extract resources. He is arguing from a macro-societal structural perspective.
Okay.
He believes that biological imperatives are the underlying operating system of human nature. They run in the background. When you remove the cultural software that restrains those primitive impulses, the software of religion, duty, shame, and patriarchal order, the hardware naturally defaults to its most primitive, self-serving setting. He applies this broadly because he believes the institutions themselves, the HR departments, the family courts, the media, are fundamentally structured to reward, protect, and incentivize this toxic biological behavior while severely penalizing any man who attempts to resist or name it. He is demanding that men see the matrix for what it is, statistically and structurally, rather than blinding themselves with romanticized anomalies.
Okay, so if we accept this incredibly bleak diagnosis of the modern world, a world where the language is corrupted, the physical infrastructure is collapsing due to mandated incompetence, and biological relationships are reduced to state-subsidized parasitism, the obvious question becomes one of survival. What is the author's proposed defense mechanism for the individual man? If you wake up and realize you are trapped in this matrix and the system controls your vocabulary, how do you actually fight back?
This brings us to a really fascinating pivot in the book. Riker introduces the concept of trivium warfare. He argues that because the cultural Marxists have captured all the institutions, you cannot fight them using their own rules. You can't win a debate in a rigged system.
So what do you do?
Instead, you have to assault their foundational epistemology. You have to crash their operating system in real time. And to do that, he arms his readers with the classical trivium.
The trivium, that's an ancient educational framework. We're talking about grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Exactly. The trivium was the foundational bedrock of classical Western education for centuries. First, grammar defining the mechanics of language and terms. Second, logic, the mechanics of thought and identifying fallacies. Third, rhetoric, the application of language to persuade and instruct. Riker repurposes these not as dusty academic subjects to be studied in a library, but as tactical psychological weapons to be deployed in the boardroom and the public square.
How does that actually work in practice? Like, how do you weaponize grammar?
Well, he starts by explaining the nature of the adversary. Riker says that when you argue with an intersectional feminist, a diversity consultant, or a woke ideologue, you are not debating a free-thinking human being who arrived at their conclusions through rational deduction. He refers to them using a gaming term, non-player characters, or NPCs.
NPCs. Characters controlled by the computer in a video game, running on pre-programmed dialogue trees.
Right. He claims these individuals are entirely populated by pre-installed, socially engineered linguistic software. They don't think, they recite. They are addicted to the moral vanity of victimhood. Their minds are repositories of viral slogans completely severed from objective reality.
So his point is that you can't just debate them on the facts, because their programming doesn't recognize facts.
Precisely. If you engage their premise, if you try to defend yourself against their accusations, you lose. So your first strike is grammar. You refuse to accept their undefined terms. When an NPC uses a weaponized word like equity, toxic masculinity, or systemic, you halt the conversation and force them to define the term objectively. You strip away the emotional resonance and demand a concrete definition.
And then comes the second stage logic.
Yes. And the core of his logical defense relies on an absolute refusal to accept the modern conflation of subjective offense with objective harm. This is paramount. Riker demands that men use intense stoic emotional regulation to force logically rigorous distinctions, what the ancient philosophers called the distinguo.
I want to focus on that conflation, because it seems to be the engine of modern outrage culture. He argues that the Matrix survives solely by blurring the line between feeling offended and being physically harmed. If someone is offended by a statement of biological fact, like noting that men are physically stronger than women, they claim they have been harmed, and therefore the speaker is committing violence.
Exactly. And Riker writes that objective harm is a measurable physical violation of natural law, private property, or bodily integrity. A person feeling offended is merely an emotional state. It is a triviality of the ego. By accepting the feminist premise that words are violence, men surrender their logos, their fundamental capacity for reason. Riker commands his readers to ruthlessly, coldly separate these categories. When the mob screams that they feel unsafe because of your privilege, you deploy the distinguo. You demand falsifiable metrics. You force them to defend their anti-empirical emotional claims against the cold, hard steel of classical logic.
Let's play this out so the listener can really grasp the mechanics. Say I'm that same male employee from our earlier example. I get called into HR because I told a manager their project timeline was mathematically impossible. The HR rep says, "Your tone made the manager feel unsafe, and your insistence on the math is a manifestation of toxic patriarchal need to be right." Walk me through how Riker says I should handle that using trivium warfare.
Okay, under Riker's protocol, you do not apologize. You do not explain your intentions. You sit calmly, you deploy stoic emotional regulation, and you initiate the trivium. First, grammar. You say, please provide the objective, company-wide definition of toxic patriarchal need. Until that is defined with falsifiable metrics, I cannot respond to the accusation.
The HR rep is probably going to stutter
Yeah.
because they've never been asked to define it. They just use it as a club.
Exactly. Then you pivot to logic and the distinguor. You say, the manager's feeling of being unsafe is a subjective emotional state. My statement regarding the mathematical impossibility of the timeline is an objective fact. We will not conflate the two. Are we here to discuss the objective failure of the project timeline, or are we here to manage the manager's subjective emotional regulation? Because I am an engineer, not a therapist.
Wow. I mean, if you actually said that in a modern HR meeting, the institutional nervous breakdown would be immediate. And Riker spotlights a fascinating historical case study to prove that this exact method works James Damore at Google in 2017.
James Damore is the perfect real-world manifestation of trivium warfare in action. Damore was a software engineer at Google who wrote a 10-page internal memo. He utilized strict stoic emotional regulation, empirical data, and evolutionary psychology to critique Google's ideological echo chamber and its diversity hiring policies. He didn't rant, he just laid out the scientific literature regarding biological differences in population interests between men and women.
And the collective response from the tech industry and the media was absolute shrieking hysteria.
It was a meltdown of unprecedented proportions. But Riker praises Damore because Damore committed the ultimate heresy. He remained completely stoically unintimidated. He didn't make an error in his data. His crime was blasphemy against the Uniparty's religion of blank slate equity. Damore used calm, logical syllogisms to dismantle unfalsifiable dogma. He proved that a single man, armed with data and stoicism, who refuses to apologize or grovel, can trigger an entire institutional collapse. The system couldn't debate him, so they just fired him, thereby proving his point entirely.
It sounds like, think about playing a rigged casino game. You sit down at the blackjack table, and after a few hands, you realize the deck is stacked, the house is cheating. In the past, conservatives or traditionalists would just sit there trying to draw better cards, hoping to win a hand.
Yeah.
Riker's saying, you don't try to win a rigged game. You stop playing, you stand up, and you demand to see the dealer's rulebook. You expose the mechanics of the cheat to the entire room.
That is an exceptional analogy. You do not negotiate with the Matrix. You name the logical fallacy, you expose the mechanism of manipulation, and you absolutely refuse to accept the burden of collective guilt they try to place on you. And to train the mind to do this reflexively, Riker provides a practical exercise for his readers called the mute button drill.
Oh, I found this part fascinating. It's so simple, but apparently incredibly effective for breaking the spell of propaganda. Explain the mute button drill.
Right, so Riker tells his readers to turn on any mainstream news broadcast, a political panel, or even a corporate diversity training video. But instead of listening to the words, hit the mute button on your remote. Strip away the deceptive grammar. Just watch the visual data. Watch the body language of the pundits, the facial expressions, the frantic hand gestures, the visual framing of the chyrons.
And what do you see?
Without the sophisticated linguistic software running interference, you suddenly see the pure primate emotional manipulation. You see the manufactured pathos, the coordinated theatrical outrage designed to bypass your logical faculties and trigger herd-like submission. It's a way to train the mind to recognize the mechanism of the manipulation before the toxic words even reach your ears.
It's all about inoculating yourself against the emotional terrorism of the system. But here's the crux of the problem, and this leads us logically into the final segment of our deep dive. Individual logic, stoicism, and the trivium are fantastic for protecting your own mind. They keep you sane. But individual logic isn't enough to save a civilization.
No.
If the current system is a burning library, as Riker calls it, where does he say men should direct their actual physical energy? Because you can't just sit in the ashes proving logical syllogisms to yourself while the roof collapses on your family.
No, you can't. And this is where Riker transitions from a tactician into an architect. Riker is adamant that participating in, funding, or attempting to politely reform these captured legacy institutions makes a man an accomplice to his own destruction. He has a stark warning. You do not perform CPR on a corpse. You do not vote harder to elect a new undertaker. You walk away.
Which brings us to his ultimate strategy, the path of the builder, and the concept of the shadow civilization.
Riker insists that men must execute a strategic, uncompromising withdrawal. The legacy institutions, academia, the Boy Scouts, corporate America, the mainstream military, the legacy churches are entirely, terminally captured by the cultural Marxist apparatus. The parasite has eaten the host. They will never voluntarily return to sanity or objective competence. Therefore, men must build parallel lifeboats.
A shadow civilization. Entirely new, parallel institutions based on objective truth, natural law, hierarchy, and competence.
Yes. He envisions parallel economies operating outside the fiat debt system. He calls for independent classical academies where boys are taught the trivium, Latin, and mathematics instead of critical race theory and gender fluidity. He advocates for localized networks of mutual aid, private security, and agricultural independence. He argues that men must systematically redirect every ounce of their time, their treasure, and their talent exclusively into structures built by and for men.
And the fundamental atomic building block of this entire shadow civilization, according to Riker, relies on an ancient anthropological concept called the Männerbund. Let's detail this, because it is the cornerstone of his new world.
The Männerbund, which translates to the male band or the male fraternity, is one of the oldest and most universal institutions in human history. Riker cites the German ethnologist Heinrich Schurz, who extensively documented this phenomenon in 1902. The Männerbund is an exclusive male fraternity, totally separate and segregated from the domestic maternal sphere. It is not a social club. It is structured strictly upon extreme hierarchy, arduous apprenticeship, and earned, often painful initiation.
He compares the structure to the medieval guilds.
Exactly. In a medieval guild, whether stonemasons, blacksmiths, or architects, a young boy starts as an apprentice. He has no rights. He yields entirely to the command of a master. He devotes years of his life to studying the grammar and logic of his craft. He steadily climbs through established objective levels of competence until he can produce his masterwork. It was a societal machine specifically engineered for turning unformed, chaotic biological males into highly competent civilized patriarchs. The Männerbund is the forge of high civilization.
But Riker places one strict, unbending rule on these new institutions. A rule that he says cannot be compromised under any circumstances, no matter the political pressure.
Zero female oversight. Zero inclusion. Absolutely no mixed spaces.
Why is he so absolute about this? Why does he believe a mixed face mathematically guarantees the destruction of the institution?
It all comes back to the metaphor of the forge. Riker argues that a men-only space operates like a blacksmith's forge. The men are the raw iron, the shared struggle and competition is the fire, and the unvarnished, merciless critique of other men is the hammer. When an apprentice fails, or when a man's logic is flawed, he receives immediate, brutal feedback from his peers. He is mocked, he is challenged, and he is forced to improve. The standard is objective excellence.
And what happens, according to the text, when you introduce women into that specific environment?
Riker argues that the entire biological and psychological dynamic shifts instantly. When women are present, the biological male instinct to protect, provide for, or impress the women completely overrides the commitment to objective truth and rigorous standards. Honest, merciless correction of peers becomes impossible because it is viewed as mean or unsafe. Instead, the space degenerates into performative virtue signaling as men begin posturing for female approval rather than submitting to the rigorous, painful standard of their brothers.
The dynamic changes completely.
Yes. The fire is lowered because someone complains it's too hot, the hammer is padded with foam because the strikes hurt feelings, and the forge devolves into a cozy, useless waiting room where absolutely nothing of value is ever built. Every institution that admitted women in the name of equality, from the military academies to the Boy Scouts to the corporate boardrooms, was, in Riker's view, systematically dismantled and destroyed by this exact biological dynamic.
Let's ground this in reality for a second, because it is the ultimate conclusion of the book. The author is essentially telling men to entirely secede from mainstream modern society. He's calling for a total, uncompromising separation from the matrix. But practically speaking, I have to ask, how does a modern guy, a guy who works a 9-to-5, who has a mortgage, whose biggest forge moment this year was sweating while assembling an IKEA dresser, how does he build a medieval guild in his garage? How do you actually implement this shadow civilization when the IRS, the HR department, and the local school board still govern the reality of your daily life?
Riker acknowledges that the physical implementation is incredibly difficult, but he views it as a matter of literal civilizational life or death. He isn't necessarily saying you quit your corporate job tomorrow if it means your family starves in the street, but he's saying you completely, utterly withdraw your spiritual and emotional consent from that system. You treat the corporate job purely as a hostile territory for resource extraction to fund your parallel system.
You become a mercenary inside the matrix.
Precisely. And you start building the lifeboat small. You organize a weekly meeting in a garage with 5 other men. You form a physical fitness and firearms training group. You start a study cohort reading the classical Western canon and mastering the trivium. You build a local network of competent tradesmen sharing real-world skills outside the fiat economy. You pull your children out of the public indoctrination centers and form localized homeschooling co-ops. You stop investing your 401k in woke index funds that hate you, and you invest locally in hard assets.
Step by step.
It is a slow, methodical, generational process of building local resilience. Because Riker believes that when the mainstream system inevitably collapses under the weight of its own mandated incompetence, when the planes stop flying and the grid goes down, the shadow civilization must be there, ready to catch the survivors and rebuild.
It's a call to become the uncompromising architects of a new reality. He ends with a mandate to the reader. Stop apologizing for your biological birthright. Pick up your tools, guard your family, and build the world you wish your sons to inherit.
It is an ethos of absolute uncompromising agency. He demands that men stop complaining on the internet about the system being rigged against them and instead dedicate their lives to building a system that is structurally impervious to the parasite.
This has been an absolutely monumental journey. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've looked at the bureaucratic capture of the Ersatz Elite, the grammatical warfare of the cultural Marxists, the terrifying physical crisis of competence, the evolutionary psychology driving the gynocentric matrix, the tactical defense of the trivium, and the ultimate strategy of building a shadow civilization through the uncompromising forge of the Minerbend.
It is a vast, deeply interconnected architecture of thought. Whether one finds themselves agreeing with the premises or recoiling from them, Riker has constructed a highly systematized, formal argument that diagnoses the modern West as a society fundamentally at war with its own foundations. It forces the reader to confront the mechanics of their reality.
And that leaves us with a deep, lingering question, something for you, the listener, to mull over on your own. It's a question that builds on the architecture of Riker's argument, but wasn't explicitly answered in the text. Let's assume for a moment that men successfully follow this book's advice. Millions of competent men withdraw their consent. They build completely isolated, parallel shadow civilizations based on strict natural law, hierarchy, and objective competence, entirely separate from the mainstream gynocentric matrix. What happens when that highly competent, well-resourced shadow system eventually, inevitably, collides with the failing mainstream matrix?
Yeah, what then?
Do they exist in a permanent, tense Cold War, ignoring each other across an ideological border? Or does a society structurally split in two, one half built on inclusion and the other half built on merciless competence, inevitably face a much deeper, more volatile physical reckoning? How long can the arsonists and the builders occupy the same landmass before the spark catches?
That is the ultimate terrifying question of the 21st century, and it is the exact historical precipice that Riker believes we are standing on right now.
If you want to explore these intense, provocative arguments firsthand and see how the author structures his proofs down to the last detail, I highly encourage you to check out Amazon, Kindle, and Google Playbooks to buy Ersatz Elite. Dive into the text yourself, interrogate the arguments, and see the architecture up close.
And if you want to see how these theories are being applied to current events in real time, Riker is actively building this community right now. You can follow his ongoing work, his essays, and his community building at Conrad Riker on Substack. That's conradriker.substack.com.
Thank you so much for taking this incredible, exhaustive deep dive with us today. The world is complex, the ideas are heavy, but understanding the arguments shaping our culture, even the most controversial ones, is the only way to navigate it with open eyes. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons on your way out so we can keep bringing you these deep explorations. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative, keep learning, and keep diving deep.